Today we are doing a 6-month review on the Sony A7IV from a Lumix fanboy, being myself. I've used the GH5, then I moved to the S5, and now I'm finally on the A7IV. And so I definitely qualify as a heavy Lumix user. As a Lumix user, there's always a part of you that thinks about the Sony, the dark side. What's the autofocus like? Is it better? Is it going to change my life? And we will discuss all of that today and provide a quick review. So just for some context, I'm a content creator. I take a lot of photos, I shoot a lot of videos, and I don't really shoot very high production videos. I don't shoot any weddings or any like music videos or anything like that. No legit films or anything, so keep that in mind. And in terms of experiences with both cameras, we're going to be talking about real world examples and my actual experience using both cameras, and not looking at graphs and stuff like that. Alright, so let's dive into the video capabilities of the Sony A7IV. And previously, when using Lumix cameras, there is a God-given picture profile called Cine Like D or Cine Like D version 2 on the S5. And it's just a really nice Rec 709 profile that is really flat, and you can do a lot of color grading and basically get as much dynamic range as you can without actually using a log profile and adding extra workflow. And I really miss that on the Sony A7IV. The Sony A7IV does have the S-Cinetone picture profile, but honestly, I think it's pretty overhyped. So my main problem with S-Cinetone on the Sony A7IV is it's a pretty underwhelming picture profile due to the lack of dynamic range and how flat the profile actually is. For example, if you expose for anything in the shadows and it looks decent on the viewfinder / LCD screen, once you go back on the computer, you'll realize the highlights are completely blown out and that's completely gone. So even when you're trying to expose for the highlights and then bring the shadows back up in post, the image does not look very good, and you can really see the difference in dynamic range and higher contrast scenes, and why S-Log is the only way to go, and why I really don't like shooting in S-Cinetone. If you plan to buy the Sony A7IV, you kind of have to learn how to shoot S-Log 3. It's a bit more of a process, and it's honestly not that hard, and it definitely rivals a Lumix camera, which I have a quick comparison that we'll quickly talk about right now from me in the future. So right off the bat, here are two 4K 30fps 10-bit log videos from both cameras. So for both cameras, I shot them at f3.5 at 20mm, same 100th of a second shutter speed. I bumped up the ISO till both cameras were at 0 on the multimeter. I then chucked the standard log conversion lot for both cameras, and as you can see, the Sony footage comes out a bit darker, but let's raise the shadows so they look fairly similar in terms of exposure. It's also worth noting, with the same shutter speed and the same aperture, I had to raise the ISO on the Lumix S5 to 25,600, whereas on the Sony A7IV, I only had to raise it to 16,000 for the multimeter to both read 0 on each camera. From this very unscientific test, these are my final thoughts. The noise in the shadows was a bit more unpleasant on the S5, which is kind of surprising, but regardless, wasn't that much better. Dynamic range, sharpness, etc. I feel like are all extremely similar. In terms of colors, I feel like the Lumix has a bit more of a natural and more pleasing color space in my opinion. And lastly, autofocus actually worked pretty decently until the lights were turned off and the Sony reigned supreme. Overall, video on the A7IV is amazing, and as a previous Lumix user, I don't feel like I'm missing much. I have had to learn some new things which some people may not like, but overall I feel like I can get great results with both cameras. But that being said, because I'm not a hardcore filmmaker, there are definitely more options on the Lumix S5 to produce more professional videos, more video-centric features, which we'll talk about a bit more later, and also more ProRes options and whatnot. So keep that in mind. If you're a hardcore videographer, the Lumix is probably better. Alright, so now looking at photos on the Sony A7IV, I feel like the photos it can take is really amazing. It's really nice to be able to have that 33 megapixels to work with. Crop mode is very handy. It can get my 17-28 Tamron lens to about 42mm. Obviously, crop mode literally just crops the image, so it's not giving you like extra depth of field or anything. But when you're in a pinch and you need that extra reach, it's very helpful. So overall, the Sony A7IV takes amazing photos, and I feel like it is a slightly more photo-centric compared to Lumix S5. So now moving along to IBIS. As a Lumix user, I was always scared about the Sony Earthquake IBIS, especially on the Sony A7 III. It's safe to say that it is a lot better on the Sony A7IV, but it still does not compete with the Lumix S5, unfortunately. That being said, it's not super far off. You can definitely tell it is more shaky. But that being said, having Catalyst Browse as a backup feature to try and get really smooth results could actually put the Sony A7IV ahead of the Lumix S5 in terms of pure stabilization, not IBIS. One thing that people don't really mention is that once you go beyond 24 mils, so for about like anything from 15, 16, 20 millimeters, you start to see a little IBIS wobble in Lumix cameras and even on Canon cameras. And that's something that you can't get rid of in post. It's just going to be baked in your footage and you're kind of stuck with that look. But if you use callus brows with like a 17mm lens, for example, there is no wobble from the IBIS of the Sony A7 IV. So the fact that we do have the option of callus brows kind of lifts the Sony A7 IV to a pretty neck and neck place with the Lumix S5. But unfortunately, not having good IBIS kind of messes up your photos when you take them handheld. You can't open the shutter for as long as you can with a Lumix S5. I mentioned this in my last video, but you could take much longer exposures, maybe up to even like 1 second with a wide lens with the Lumix S5. You can definitely not do that on the Sony A7 IV. I'm very hesitant to even open my shutter to like 1/10 of a second. Now let's quickly talk about ergonomics. The ergonomics on the Lumix S5 is just much better than the Sony A7 IV. It is definitely a step up from previous Sony cameras and you can definitely get by. The whole setup with the flick button to change to photo and video modes, it is an improvement from previous Sony cameras, but if you just take a page from Lumix, how photo and video mode works on Lumix is that there's just one single mode for taking photos, and there's another dial to change between different modes, for example time-lapse, burst modes, etc, etc, and that's just really easy to use. However, that being said, using the Sony A7 IV, I've definitely found myself flicking through the modes trying to switch from photo to video, where the settings keep changing and then I feel like I'm missing shots, I'm taking longer than I should be, and it's just a bit of a whole mess using a Sony camera compared to the Lumix. With all these customizable buttons on the Sony A7 IV, the difference in ergonomics is not that bad, but you just have to take more time setting up these buttons, and you kind of need to remember about like 5 different spaces of different settings you set on the Sony A7 IV, which I even found myself forgetting. I was just like, wait, which custom button did I set for this? Which one did I do for that? And it does get a bit confusing, and it's just not as good as an experience on the Lumix. A quick note on overheating. Some Sony users have definitely reported overheating issues. I've personally experienced overheating as well, and I was only shooting like a 1080p video after like an extended amount of shooting. It was actually the FPV tutorial that I made. Watch that up there. Maybe I shot for like an hour intermittently and it just overheated. I had to wait like twice for it to cool down. Never faced anything like that on the Lumix. Alright, so now let's talk about the good old autofocus. And let's just get this out the way. The Sony A7 IV has some incredible autofocus. Like, this sticks to my eye like there's no tomorrow. It's just amazing. I feel like all these manual focus skills are just lost now because this is just so reliable and works extremely well. I know there are a lot of old heads, alright, not old heads, but videographers that strictly use manual focus and don't give a crap about autofocus, which is fair enough. And if that is you, you can skip this entire part about autofocus and it doesn't really matter. But as a content creator who needs to get shots really run and gun and likes to create videos with the least amount of effort, having this autofocus has been really helpful. While saying that, you can see how much the Lumix S5 struggles to autofocus on the 20 to 60mm lens, which is a Panasonic lens, which is kind of just like optimal circumstances for the Lumix S5. There's really no match. Personally for me, I really welcome the autofocus. It's definitely worth the money to me, which we will talk about next. Now discussing the cost of the Sony A7 IV, it's pretty expensive, about 4K for a body in Australia. I do think it is worth it because the price of autofocus is, I guess, priceless, quote unquote. But that being said, the Lumix S5 as of today, you can buy with the 20 to 60mm lens for about like 2.4K. So you're literally saving like $1,600 for a body and no lens versus the kit lens with the Lumix S5, which is a big chunk of money you can definitely spend on some good glass. However, I do think that price disparity still makes things eventually worth it on the Sony A7 IV just because of the amazing lens selection that the E-mount has. Lumix doesn't have cheap lens providers like Tamron, who actually create some really high quality lenses for a comparatively really low price. And once you buy maybe 3 lenses on the Lumix camera and you buy 3 lenses on the Sony, then honestly the price of both kits for both cameras and all your lenses would probably be very similar just because of that disparity. But that being said, if you are buying G Master lenses, then the price is still going to skyrocket with your Sony, so just keep that in mind. Also, some people may ask about Canon cameras like the R5 or the R6, but the reality is Canon is just so overpriced. The bodies are like the same price, if not more expensive. The lenses are way more expensive than E-mounts, and if money wasn't a problem, I would genuinely compare these cameras. They are on a similar level, but money is a real thing, unfortunately, and you can't justify spending so much more money on very similar performance. So that's why I don't even talk about Canon cameras. and they're like the iPhone of the camera world. Alright, so in conclusion, the Sony A7IV is an amazing camera. The video features are great. I love how it's kind of pushed me to use S-Log3. It is a bit annoying that you kind of have to put more effort to get a similar-ish result versus the good old Lumix S5. And the S5 does have more video-centric features for people who are more hardcore. The photos are definitely neck and neck, and I think the biggest disparity to me is just the lens selection and the autofocus. I do genuinely think having autofocus and that wide range of lenses you can buy, it makes secondhand lenses a bit cheaper. You have cheap options like the Tamrons. So if you are going to buy some lenses, and I'm a content creator, I need wide shots, I need bokeh, I need a lot of different variety of shots, maybe at least 3 or 4 lenses. The prices do get very similar. I'm not buying G Masters, so at the end of the day, you need to really consider your different use case and what you're planning to buy in terms of lenses. But regardless, you can't go wrong with any camera. I do feel like I am converted to Sony. That autofocus is just amazing. And I do like having cheaper lens alternatives, although overall price is probably very similar anyway. I would like to point out that the difference in photo and image quality is very marginal between the two cameras, so if that's all you're looking for and you don't care about autofocus, I would buy the Lumix S5 any day of the week. But that doesn't take anything away from how good the Sony A7IV is for what it is. And ultimately, that's kind of why there's so many Sony fanboys. They do make great cameras, as much as people don't like to hear it. This isn't paid, so I hope you enjoyed the video. Leave a like, leave a sub, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.